sweethearts, how are we all? Welcome back to my channel. This is True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. I release content on a Wednesday and a Sunday if you've just found this by accident. So if you like consistency and you like crime, this is the channel for you. Get your notifications turned on. Get a bit of a nudge whenever I'm on. Also, if you give me a like and a comment, I read every single one of them, as you will notice, because of the interaction, and I really appreciate every single one of you. For those of you who are already supporting me on Patreon, thank you. It blows my mind. I love the fact that you want to help me create content, and I've got a link below if any of you also want to do that, but no pressure. I always feel like I've got to say that because I don't want any of you loyal people who come and have the chat and the community and the engagement to ever feel under any duress. And the same to those of you who are supporting me on Patreon. If you cannot afford to, just don't. It really worries me that people at this moment in time stretch themselves. So just a bit of a word of warning there. Today's case is one that I decided to explore, one because you recommended me to experience looking at it, and I hadn't done. I didn't know this case, it was brand new to me, and it's meant that I've gone down various rabbit holes regarding my belief systems here. And I have to say that it's left me with some conflicts. And it's not that I expect other people to feel conflicted. You may very well believe that what played out absolutely should have played out. But I'm just gonna say, I worked with young offenders for nearly a decade of my life. They had done crimes and carried out crimes that were obviously reprehensible at times. And during that process, I learned to see beyond the criminal. It was essential for me to do that because I can't inspire change if all I see ultimately are the pitfalls and problems that those human beings created. Often there are reasons behind actions, and I think that it's really essential with young criminals that we try to imagine that because their brain is developing and they are not the human beings that they will be at 30, that we do consider the opportunity for those individuals to, shall we say, develop and grow and even potentially be reintegrated into our society. Every single country has different laws. So in the UK, a full life tariff, I can count on one hand really the amount of full life tariffs that exist, i.e. most people who carry out pretty heinous crimes, a bit like Colin Pitchfork, who's free at the moment, they do get to go through reparation. So they are able to work through the process of being restoratively replaced into our communities without necessarily feeling that their life has to be completely ended because of the fact that they committed these heinous crimes. You might think that that's terrible, but in the UK that exists. In America, however, in America they are hardline. And a lot of people get full life tariffs, and that means that there will be no parole ever. You will literally be in prison forever. And a lot of people agree with that position. But the case I'm going to cover today involves two 16-year-olds. And if we all look back to who we were at 16, and then we look at who we are as adults, some of you will be 16 listening to this right now. I promise you, when you're 30, you won't feel the same way about who you were then as you are in the moment at 30. This is not me trying in any way to excuse or minimize what's happened. This is a terrible, terrible crime. But I just want to set up the bias that I have in my belief system because I have watched young people who have gone down a very dark path, and then with the care and compassion and understanding and environment that allowed them to grow and change, I have seen and witnessed firsthand them thriving and becoming really, really integral, upstanding members of our community. I see that change is potential. That being said, I'm only saying it because obviously if I don't acknowledge my bias, then when I tell this story, I don't think it's fair. Because if I don't acknowledge my bias and the families of the victim look at this, they will understandably feel that maybe I'm being unfair in any way, shape or form to even imagine that someone can be rehabilitated. And I need to acknowledge that, because if I don't, and this sounds a little bit like I'm saying that young people should not always be put in prison forever, that is going to be very painful to people who disagree with that standpoint. And I just want to respect that bias because of it. So apologies if you completely disagree with me. Understand it's from my working past that I'm lending this position. So I'm going to talk today about the Scream Killers. And the reason that they are called the Scream Killers is because if you all remember Drew Barrymore, when she was in the film Scream, she was the cameo, she was babysitting, and basically her friends killed her. That's the story in Scream. And that iconic movie is believed to have been a kind of precursor for planting seeds in the two individuals who carried out this murder. The perpetrators of this crime were Brian Lee Draper, he was 16, he was born on the 21st of March 1990, and Torey Michael Adamcik, he was 16, born on the 14th of June 1990. Both of those boys came from really caring, supportive, middle-class homes. And the reason that I'm telling you about their background is because when you look at evidence and research regarding who ends up in prison or who ends up carrying out certain crimes, these statistics are evident that most have come from very dysfunctional homes. They've been brought up in abusive situations, often they've been brought up in very poor economic situations, and very often they haven't had the role models, the boundaries, the opportunities, the support that would foster a well-adjusted human being. And so part of the failure of society is failing these young people. But in this case, that isn't so. These boys are and were loved. And I say are and were loved because they still are and were loved by their family members. And even though when we look at the crimes and the absolute horror that they instilled in a community, it's almost impossible to imagine that anybody could grow up in a well-adjusted environment and act this way. We also then have to say, well, this shows us that young people, no matter where they come from, no matter who they're born to, no matter what their opportunities and privileges are, if things in their life cause resentment, exclusion, isolation, if they don't feel that they are part of something greater than just themselves, if they feel that way, it doesn't have to be that that's the reality. You can look around their life and say, no, they're fully supported. But if they don't feel that they belong, what can that foster? And I think more and more we're starting to understand that young people, when they are growing up, are so desperate to seek an identity, so desperate to feel part of something bigger than just the sum of who they are, that often they are looking for subcultures. They are looking to belong somewhere. For most of us, that might be like me, being a goth or going through a punk stage or animal rights, but it's always this searching and seeking a place where I am reflected as someone of meaning. If you don't have that, no matter what your environment growing up, you can become quite isolated. Both of the boys that I've mentioned, both of them, they were considered good students. They were not considered problematically. Brian and Torey both were individuals who kept out of trouble at school and were individuals who, to all intents and purposes, did well. Brian Draper did have a childhood stutter. That's something that I think we have to acknowledge, because when you have a stutter, when you stand out because you're different, you do get bullied very often. And he was ridiculed for that a lot. And it's very hard to imagine being in a situation where you don't have the control over your own language to a point where others can make fun of you for that. And I think that that would cause deep scars. You feel isolated, alienated, you don't feel cool, because like it or otherwise, the way that we communicate, aside from our body language, is with our voice. And for all of us who can just speak away without a problem, that wouldn't be something that we can really empathise with. But my brother has a stutter that gets really quite problematic when he's discussing certain things, and it's a constant problem because he says it's almost like never being able to be heard. So obviously Brian Draper has this issue, and it's not nice that he's bullied at all. But nonetheless, it wasn't to the extent where his parents felt that there were any problems. It wasn't to the extent where Brian Draper was standing out to such a degree that he didn't want to go to school or he couldn't get his work done. By all accounts, they were happy and talented teenagers. So these were not kids who were standing out in any way, shape or form as problematic. I will say that Brian Draper was more introverted. And probably one of the reasons for that is he'd only recently moved to the area he was living. So understandably, he had a stutter, he didn't know a lot of people. His desperation to belong would clearly be a big part of his motivation at that point in time. You want to have friends, you want to be able to hang out, you want to have fun, you're a teenager, right? And it's bloody hard being a teenager. I hated it. I don't know about you guys. I found it overwhelming, very difficult. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted. I was shit scared of the fact that everybody else seemed to know what they were doing and I really didn't. And I found life in those years really, really unhappy. So I can connect perfectly with people who are desperate to get involved with groups of other people when they're new to an area. And Brian Draper already had a stutter, didn't have a lot of friends, and was probably desperate to do anything to fit in. Now, the victim, Cassie Jo Stoddart, she was born on the 21st of December 1989. She's got 2 siblings. She's got a sister, Christy, she was 6 years older, and a brother, Andrew, 18 months younger. So she came from a really beautiful family. They were an absolutely loving, connected family. And Cassie was one of the kindest students. That's what people talk about her like, that she was one of the kindest students that was in a school. She was gorgeous. She had a smile that was just really, really beautiful, and just one of those really enchanting faces, long dark hair, the all-American girl really. She was absolutely gorgeous. And one of the things that was special about her was that she was one of those students who was just kind to everybody. So even when you think about Brian Draper, who felt like an outsider, she really warmed to him. At a time when he was struggling to fit in, at a time when he was really finding it difficult to connect, she reached out. And that says something, doesn't it, about her? It also says something about this tragedy, because the only thing that Cassie Jo Stoddart was ever guilty of was being a really kind human being, a really compassionate human being, someone who liked the underdog. And that says something really powerful about who she was. Cassie, Brian and Torey all went to the same school, Pocatello High School in Idaho. Now that city itself is a Mormon city, so obviously a lot of religious belief systems. And I have to say, in religious communities and where there's a high percentage of religious people, crime is really low. So people can say what they want about religion, but when large amounts of people live in the same area who happen to have particular moralistic beliefs, crime is really low. This is why this particular crime was so catastrophic for them, because it just did not happen. One of the connectors between Draper and Adamcik was that they both had an interest in filmmaking. Remember, they're both looking for a way to belong. And you'll see through things that I actually put through this video that this filmmaking interest that they had is really the part of their big downfall, because a lot of the things that they carried out, they did in fact film. Cassie Stoddart was a really typical teenager. She was very popular, she was very friendly. Also, just to say, she got straight A's. Her work at school was exemplary. She was an excellent student, and she was planning on studying law. So it wasn't just about her life being stolen from her. She was an individual who was going to give something back to the community. She was somebody that we all want as a daughter. That's the kind of child we all want, isn't it? Straight A student, lovely to everyone, gorgeous to look at, with an absolute knowledge of what she wanted. And fundamentally, she wanted to see justice served. So when we lose a person like that, it even amplifies the loss, doesn't it? Every loss is horrific. Every traumatic death is preventable and terrible. But I think when you look at somebody like her, the 360 that Cassie was of being just a really great human being, when that kind of loss occurs, it is profound, both for the family and also for the community and the friends that she shared. She loved drawing, she loved music. At the time of her death, she was saving up for a car. So there were so many things that she was doing that just remind you of what it's like to be that typical teenager. Everything's about hope, isn't it? It's all about potential. It's about growing up and growing into the human being that you're becoming. And it's something that's to be celebrated usually. On the night that Cassie is killed, she's actually house sitting for her aunt and uncle, Alison and Frank Contreras. It hurts my heart when I think about them. They have tried selling their house for many years, but obviously because somebody died there, it's caused them a great deal of problems. And also the house that they built, they created their dream home. It's absolutely stunning. It was a place that was meant to be for their family to grow. It was everything that they ever wanted to create. And the idea that every single day waking up in that home is a reminder of the niece that they lost. And also I think the level of responsibility they probably feel towards it, because she was there on her own. And this idea that if I hadn't asked her to do A, B or C, this wouldn't have occurred. We see that constantly in the psychology of survivors. Survivor guilt is really challenging because you're always thinking about, why did it happen to this person that I cared so deeply for? And how could I have prevented it? And they beat themselves up for that regularly, even though they're completely innocent victims. So at the time, she's looking after their pets, and the house itself is pretty private. It had 1.5 acres of land, so it wasn't somewhere that anybody would be able to run because of the fact that it was isolated. Now, Draper and Adamcik, they were friends of hers. They knew that her aunt and uncle were going to be away for the weekend, and they knew that that meant that they would have access to her. It's dreadful to think that two people that Cassie believed were her friends were actually plotting her demise, because they video this. You can actually hear them talking about it. It's horrible to think that while she's chatting away at a locker with one of these guys, he's actually already planned how they're going to kill her. She's got no idea that she's a victim. And when you listen to them saying that, you know, we're sorry, Cassie, but, you know, we're going to kill you, you're just sitting and thinking to yourself, are they actually really meaning it in that moment? How much was meant before the act? Because I often see that with a folie à deux. Two people, to all intents and purposes, who seem like good human beings, if they had not met, would it ever have happened? You have to ask yourself that question, don't you?
September 22nd, 2006. We're skipping our 4th hour. We're writing our plan right now. I'm telling Cassie's family, but she item number 1. We have to stick with the plan. And she's perfect, so she's gonna die.
Brian Draper, for example, had a hugely unhealthy interest in Columbine. And there is a lot of young people who have found a real intoxication about Columbine. He even describes the fact that when he looked at Columbine, what he felt was he would stand out just for a short while. That his life would have meaning for just a short amount of time. The fact that suddenly his name would be in all the papers, that he would have power. And when you feel powerless and helpless and invisible, it would give him, in his viewpoint, visibility. It's twisted. It doesn't make sense to anybody who's well adjusted. But that feeling about not having meaning was profound for him.
There should be no law against killing people. I know it's a wrong thing, but hell, you restrict somebody from it, they're gonna want it more.
On the night of the killing, Cassie is hanging out with a boyfriend. He comes around 6 p.m. in the evening. And later, because Cassie, being the lovely, kind human being that she is, she's actually invited Draper and Adamcik to watch a movie with them. They were going to watch Kill Bill. Cassie's boyfriend and Torey Adamcik were really good friends as well. And obviously Adamcik is really good mates with Brian. So it's a great situation, you know? So Cassie even gives Brian and Torey a tour of the house, which is so ironic when you think about what they're planning to carry out. They start watching the movie together, but then at some point, Brian and Torey say, well, they want to go because they want to go and watch a film at the cinema. So before the film ends, they actually leave. However, at this point, Brian Draper had gone down and unlocked the back door to the basement during the tour. So planning, clearly, to return later on. Not long after Brian and Torey leave, Matt actually calls Torey and says, can he stay over at his house? But his mother says no. And one of the things that Matt realises is it's quite an odd call because for some reason he's whispering. So Torey's whispering to him, but he kind of says it's because he's in the cinema. He was actually in the basement of the house. So when that phone call was made, Brian and Torey were in the basement. sends shivers down your spine, doesn't it? It turns out that Brian and Torey hadn't gone to the cinema. All they'd done, they'd walked down the street, they'd doubled back, and then they'd entered through the basement door. At this point, they were dressed in dark clothes, gloves, and white masks. That really is the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? And I think to myself, what was going on in their minds at this time? Was it a done deed? Were they definitely going to go ahead with this? Or at this moment in time, are they still almost acting it? Where, yes, they've talked about it. Yes, they've filmed each other. Yes, they've said that they're going to kill Cassie. Yes, they've got dressed up. Yes, they've gone into that basement. But are they really genuinely thinking they're going to go through with it? That thing about two people egging each other on, always with the power to just take a step back and say, guys, this is ridiculous. Like, let's just stop doing this. At this point, both of them have got a knife as well. Now, during that phone call when Matt told Torey that he wasn't going to be able to stay over and his mum was collecting him, he also let them know that that meant that Cassie would be on her own. I do think, potentially, if he hadn't been picked up, that he might have been killed too. And what's really sad about this in particular is that Matt had called his own mother and said that the house was having some weird things happening. There were noises coming from the basement, the electricity had gone on and off, and he was a little bit unnerved and he wanted to stay with Cassie. And his mother said no, that she wanted to come and get him. But I have to give it to her. She said, listen, Cassie can come and stay with us. I'll drop her back off in the morning. She can look after the animals then. Let's get her out. But Cassie, being Cassie, did what she thought was right. She'd promised to look after that house. She promised to look after those pets. And so she stayed. In so many cases where people are murdered, it's almost like their diligence and compassion and care is used against them. So now, Brian and Torey know that not only have they got in the house and the free reign because of the fact that they've got in, they've only got Cassie to deal with. And you think about that. 2 guys, 1 girl. It's going to be impossible for her, isn't it? Now, one of the things that Brian and Torey want to do is they want to scare Cassie. They want to make this more than just a killing. They want her to know that something is going on. So they smashed 2 ashtrays down in the basement, really loud noises. As I said, they turned the electrics off because what they wanted to do is to lure both Matt and Cassie down to the basement. That way they could scare them. But Matt and Cassie didn't come down. I have to say, neither would I. I'd have probably have left the house immediately. That's the kind of way I'd have reacted to this. But they're not expecting anything, are they? This is the thing about these kind of intruder killings. The psychology that you have is that it wouldn't actually be potential murderers. I mean, at worst, we may imagine that somebody is coming to burgle the home. But even then, most of us just put bangs and crashes down to things just being knocked off shelves or falling off things, and there were animals in the house. So to some degree, you just excuse away. You have that bias. You don't want to think there are 2 people dressed in masks with knives down in your basement, luring you there to murder you. They don't go down. And that must have spooked Torey and Brian a little bit because, as I said, human beings are unpredictable and it's not working in the way that they imagined. One of the dogs, however, Matt reported saying was just constantly staring down into the basement and barking. They were obviously aware that the dog felt that there was something untoward happening. And even though Cassie was scared, she still didn't go home with Matt. I just wish she'd got in that car. I really do. It's so sad that her duty to look after those pets in that house meant that she stayed at her peril. And I also feel like I'm sad that she didn't get Matt's mum and Matt and her to check the basement because it is a big difference, one person being left with 2 to fight than it is for 3 people to go down and actually meet the perpetrators. And I would imagine if all 3 of them, particularly with an adult, had gone down to do that, the boys may well have acted like it was just a prank and that could have ended it. But nonetheless, that wasn't how it played out. So at 10:30 in the evening, Matt leaves and Cassie's left by herself. Brian and Torey hear that. They would have heard the car drive up. They would have heard the door open. the door close, and the car drive away. So now they know. Cassie is completely by herself. And then they turn the electrics off again. Imagine how you would feel. You're in 1.5 acres of land, no neighbours, you're 16, you're on your own. You've heard these noises, the dog's freaking out, and now the lights have gone off. And Brian and Torey would know how she'd feel. We all know how that feels. We've all been in situations where we're unnerved. Some of us have been in situations where actually that unnerving has led to us being in situations that have been very painful to deal with. When you've had your home burgled, when somebody's threatened you, even worse, when people have violated you sexually. These things happen in homes very, very rarely. But you have the hackles go up, don't you? You know that there is something not right. And they would have wanted to inflict that on her. So the psychological torment that they're trying to create is very profound. But she doesn't go down again. Why would you? She's probably just praying that it's just her making things up in her head, and it's a house that could have electrics that are a little bit faulty, they'd gone off and come on before, so she's probably believing that it's going to be all right. They then go upstairs and they slam the closet door. So she's watching TV at this point. Can you imagine what that would feel like? She knows that her family aren't due back. She knows that Matt's gone. And suddenly the door is slamming. She is going to be so scared. And then she's watching TV and in they walk. Just imagine. Imagine what that would be like. Seeing two people dressed in black with horrific masks on, terrifying masks on, both armed. She apparently said, "I'm going to kick your ass." But obviously that was just a reaction, trying to suggest to them, back off. I think that shows great courage and great bravery, because I don't think I'd have been able to string a sentence together in that situation. But at that point, they both attack her. And they attack her brutally. She's stabbed 30 times, and 12 of those were potentially fatal. And they also stabbed her mostly around the chest, the back, the neck. So very, very serious stab wounds. And then they just leave her. Just get in the car, go off, buy cinema tickets to create the alibi, because remember, they've told Matt that they're going to the cinema. That's why they left early. They've got the tickets now. So they feel that they've kind of created this alibi that's going to stick. All the while filming themselves and their reaction to it.
I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a fucking joke.
I'm shaking.
I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie. Oh, fuck. That felt like it wasn't even real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the fuck up, we gotta get our act straight.
Okay.
When I listen to the voices of those boys, as you have just listened to, it's excitement and shock, isn't it? There is a mix of excitement, shock, and actually disbelief. You'll hear the way that there's disbelief in what's happened. They're filming this situation as if it's almost not real. In fact, he even suggests it was over so quick. It didn't feel real. That emotional immaturity that they've just slaughtered an innocent victim, slaughtered a friend of theirs who only hours earlier had welcomed them into the home, shown them around it, because they were part of her inner circle of trust. They've gone in, they've brutally slain her, and now they're recording it with this excitement, but also, like I said, there is an emotional immaturity of the reality. They have killed their friend, they are videoing their reaction to it, and the shakiness in their voice Yes, on one level it seems like they've had a great time, but on another level I can hear the sense of disconnection and disbelief with their actions. Matt rings Cassie constantly. He even, the next day, goes and spends the evening with Torey and his family. And he's saying, I can't get in touch with Cassie. And he says to Torey, would it be okay if you drove me over to hers? And Torey says, no, I can't. I've not got enough gas. All the while, knowing that if he'd taken him there, Matt would have discovered Cassie's body lay on the floor. In fact, the person who discovers Cassie is her 13-year-old cousin. She discovers her in the blood-soaked upstairs living room. That 13-year-old girl tried killing herself because of that. She was so traumatised by what she saw that she tried to take her own life. These are the ramifications that victims' families go through. It changed the course of that 13-year-old kid's life forever. She should have just been enjoying being a child, shouldn't she? But everything ended on that day. So Torey and Brian didn't just steal the life of one girl, one child. They ruined the life of another, at least for a period of time. Imagine walking in and finding a much-loved family member just lying on the floor in front of the TV, on her back, arms raised above her head, defence wounds all over her hands, one of her fingers almost completely chopped off. Then imagine Matt finding out that his girlfriend, this person that he's having this relationship with, that he cares for, finding out that when he left that night, she was murdered. Imagine the guilt that he has, that his mother has, particularly his mother, because she will blame herself for not forcing Cassie to get in that car and to go away from that place. But nonetheless, these are the ripples of these kind of events. We often focus on the person who's lost, which is right to do, but the impact is far-reaching. I've worked in murder cases. I've worked with parents of murdered children. I've worked with brothers and sisters of murdered children. Believe me, it is a stain that never resolves itself, ever. And there's that part of me that also thinks about how Matt must have been feeling when he made the 15 calls that he made to Cassie. You know, desperately trying to get in touch with his girlfriend, knowing somewhere that there was something that wasn't right. Cassie's mother had also been trying to contact her, and in fact she was so worried that she drove to the Contreras house on Sunday. And when she got there were neighbours and there were police outside the property. Can you imagine how that would be? I mean, yeah, we all worry about our kids, don't we? But you're not driving to see where your child is thinking that they've been murdered. You're thinking maybe they got drunk, you know? Maybe they had a party. Maybe they've done something naughty. You're not imagining that you're going to turn up and you're going to see police dealing with the deceased daughter that was meant to be coming home. And it was Frank Contreras who actually had to tell her that Cassie wasn't ever going to come home again, that she'd been murdered. Anna became completely hysterical. That was her mother. Of course she did. Of course she did. You wouldn't be anything but hysterical. And she actually immediately called Matt, Cassie's boyfriend, asking him what had he done to Cassie. And I get that, because 9 out of 10 times she'd have been right. 9 out of 10 times it would be the boyfriend or the partner, it would be. So she gets straight on the phone and she's accusing him, and that's how Matt found out that Cassie had died. He didn't have somebody kindly come round and compassionately express the loss that he's going to go through. He heard when her mother basically said, "What did you do to my daughter? She's dead." And again, how would Matt process that trauma? Because that must have been absolutely horrific. So right now, the community is thrown into disarray. A much-loved member of their community has been brutally murdered. Again, a level of overkill. 12 of those inflictions, they would have killed her. They kept stabbing. They kept stabbing. Now, the investigation itself, let's be honest, Torey and Brian are not sophisticated killers. They're 16 years old. And let's just bring a few things into play that make it clear that they had not really thought this through effectively. First of all, they had recorded themselves planning the murder. They had identified who they were going to kill. They'd identified when they were going to kill her. They'd identified how they were going to kill her. And they even talked about when they'd killed her, all on tape. Not the most sensible thing to do if you're trying to get away with murder. Of course, the big question is, were they at this point trying to get away with murder? Or were they, as Brian described, wanting to be known, wanting to be seen, wanting to be visible? Now, as you can imagine, the investigation goes ahead at full steam. They want to bring whoever has murdered Cassie to justice ASAP. This is a horrific crime and also indicative potentially of other crimes that might unfold. Remember, when we see this kind of killing, often it can be a prerequisite to serial killings because it's so violent, so aggressive, so premeditated that they are going to be on a time scale worried that somebody else is going to do this again. Obviously, they don't know it's been two people. It could just be one maniac on the loose. And they start asking around the local area for people to come out with any evidence that they can bring forward, any strange behaviours, and so on and so forth. And Lo Lucero comes forward and says, well, actually, Torey Adamcik asked me to buy some knives for him. So clearly Torey has created this backstory that he wants to start a knife collection, but he's not 18, so he can't buy one, so he enlists Joe's help. Brian, Torey and Joe all go to the local pawn shop, get some money out of the cash machine on the way, and they picked out 4 knives. Brian chose 3 and Torey chose 1. So instantly, Joe is able to tell the police, well, I didn't think that this was an issue, but now I'm realising that this could be a really serious issue. They are in their friendship group, and on reflection, it's a bit strange that they got knives just before a horrible murder of somebody that was close to them. So it doesn't take long for the police to realise that they're dealing with 2 particular suspects. That's Brian and Torey. And they take them in for questioning on the 27th of November 2006. It's at this point, it all goes a little bit south for both of these 16-year-olds. Remember, it's terrifying being interrogated. When you're being interrogated by men or women who are profoundly good at their job, you are going to feel very afraid, particularly when you are potentially facing first-degree murder. Imagine what's going through your mind. They haven't had a lot of time to think about what they need to say to try to cover their tracks. What they both do is they both say that they went to see a film and that was their alibi. Now, what is any investigator going to do? They're going to be like, yeah? What happened in the film? Now, if you can't describe what went on in a film that you watched a few days earlier, there's a problem, isn't there? And neither Torey nor Brian can even recount a tiny part of the film. So even though they've got their tickets, it's clear that they didn't go. They also, when they start to crack, just blame each other. And I understand that. I really do. When you're 16 and you're suddenly in a position where you're being interrogated and you know the house of cards is falling down, psychologically keeping it together is near impossible. And what are you going to do? You're going to think, okay, how do I minimise my involvement? So Brian says basically, okay, I was there, but I didn't do anything. It was all Torey. It was Torey's idea. It was Torey who was the one who suggested it. And the reality is I just went along with it, not thinking it was really going to happen. And Brian is also the person who takes the police to the evidence, where the masks are, where the tape is that they've recorded themselves on, and basically the clothing that they've tried to burn. And the problem is that when they set fire to it, it doesn't actually damage the tape that they've recorded enough so they can repair it. So not only now have they got the fact that one of them has admitted where the evidence is and the fact that they're blaming each other for the murders, they now have a tape that says that they were both equally involved in the planning and preparation. And even though both of them are simply saying, well, we just thought it was going to be a joke, we just thought it was going to be a prank, we didn't really think that the other one was going to go through with it, it's damning. It is damning. Because they seem to be enjoying the planning and preparation. Now, Brian, when you listen to him interviewed, is incredibly eloquent. They both are, actually. As 21-year-olds, when I've heard them interviewed, they are eloquent young men growing up with a realisation of what they did. And one of the things I'd say about Brian is that he does try to take a great deal of responsibility about the killing. He does acknowledge and accept that what he did was completely reprehensible and wrong, and that he can never ever do anything to make up for that. That Cassie's death will always be blood on his hands, it's as simple as that. But he also talks about the fact that he'd been really interested in Columbine and wanting to stand out, whereas Torey was very interested in the idea of scream killing, these kind of murder slay movies, and that actually he just thought, well, may as well stand out that way. So he shifted his interest from Columbine to this idea of these kind of slay killings. But that he says that Torey was the one who had this particular predilection. Nonetheless, he doesn't blame Torey. He equally recognises that his part in it was as profound. Torey struggles more. I will be honest with you. Torey struggles to take responsibility for the crime. He very much sees himself as an innocent participant, just an observer. But the police do realise very early on that both Torey and Brian were involved. They both stabbed her. Now, Brian will say that Torey made him. No one can make you stab somebody. I'm sorry. Most people, if you're in a situation where you think it's a prank going wrong and suddenly one of you is stabbing somebody, your instinct would be to stop them and to call an ambulance. There is no innocent in this scenario. There is only guilty on both sides. That tape gives prosecutors every single thing they need. It shows Brian and Torey planning the killing. It also showed that Cassie Stoddart was going to be their first victim. In fact, you'll hear on the tape,
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddart. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get?
So as you can hear from that, the fact that they're saying, how perfect can you get? I mean, like, holy shit, dude. This idea that they're really excited about the potential. And then listen to what Torey says.
I mean, like, holy shit, dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah.
So actually that sense of being turned on by it, the idea that killing is something that sexually is motivating them. Now I know this is probably just young people speaking in a way that they think they're meant to speak in this situation, but it is very chilling to imagine that these are two young men talking about a friend. Cassie was a friend. They also talk about a death list because they aren't intending to just murder one person. They want to go on a killing spree, and the police actually find that as well. And Matt, Cassie's boyfriend, was also on the list. So, as I said earlier, the only reason that Matt Beckham is alive today is because his mother would not let him stay over at that house. And also, what comes out is that they'd actually tried to kill around 10 times, but every single time they tried, the victim wasn't alone. So this was not the first attempt at killing, this was the first successful attempt at killing. They really wanted to take out whatever rage they had, whatever insecurities, whatever misfit feelings that they believed society betrayed within them. They wanted to take that out on innocent victims. Both of them admitted that they were relatively obsessed with serial killers and they wanted to be infamous. As I said, the fact that Brian in particular had an absolute obsession with Columbine High School massacre, which is obviously Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who went in and did the most horrific, heinous killings. I will cover that in another video because those two were so scrupulous and diligent in the way that they went about it. I'm actually surprised that more people didn't die. And if their bombs that they'd made had gone off, they would have. But for whatever reason, the subculture that those two men created, Brian fell victim to. And he wanted to follow in the footsteps of people like Ted Bundy, the Hillside Strangler, and the Zodiac Killer. So this idea that because people are told you should not kill people, it's like, well, now I really want to kill people. It's like, no, Torey, that's not how we feel. We're quite resolved and happy with the fact that people don't go around killing people and that we shouldn't kill people because it means you kill people, which would be a terrible situation. It would be like living permanently in the purge, which is literally a recurring nightmare I have about the way society is going right now. But you can see that immaturity, can't you? And then the way that Brian responds to him here.
sick psychopaths that get pleasure of killing other people. We're gonna be just like Scream, except real life terms. We're going to make history. People will die.
I mean, that in itself is just horrifying, isn't it? But does it not pang of the dramatic to you? Does it not pang of that childish immaturity? Like a script, right? Trying to sound as okay as possible with murder. But I do wonder what was really going on in their minds. I do wonder whether one of them was just waiting for the other to stop. One of the things that I'm going to play for you now isn't gory at all, but it's probably one of the most upsetting parts of this video. And it's Cassie the day before she died. Because Brian films her at her locker.
Really actually gonna do it? Oh, yeah? I was like, what's the first thing? Hey, look, it's Cassie. Hey, look, I don't know. Hello, Cassie. I'm getting you on tape, okay? Say hi, please. Hi. Okay, see ya. Have you seen Torey? He's supposed to meet me here at 7:30, and it's 8:19. He's an hour late. You don't even care, do you? Okay.
What do you notice there? You notice that she's engaging, she's sweet, she has no fear of him. She's not even annoyed that he's videoing her. You know, she's just going through the motions of being a nice human being. And all the while, he's doing it for this sick film where he murders her. The fact that he says, "I'm sorry, Cassie's family, but she had to be the one. We have to stick to the plan, and she's perfect, so she's gonna die."
It was 9:50, September 22nd, 2006. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors. It's all locked. Now we just gotta wait.
And listen to the language of Brian. He says, "Unfortunately, we have the grueling task of killing our two friends, and they are right in that house just down the street. We checked out the whole house. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I unlocked the back doors. It's all unlocked. Now we just gotta wait. We've waited for this for a long time." So they're really prepping themselves, aren't they? They're really prepping themselves to go ahead, bolstering one another's confidence through the screen. And I think that's so important, because when you are videoing things, you are one step away. Emotionally, you might find that difficult to connect with, but I promise you, when people are filming things, it's almost like they are in a movie. It disassociates themselves from that personal experience. So even though this seems like they're being very confident and they are kind of creating this scenario and playing it out, they're also one step away from the reality of what they're doing. You can't quite believe that these two ordinary middle-class loved kids could ever have contemplated doing this. And when they look at the autopsy, it reveals that 2 knives had been used, so it indicates that they both were involved. One had a serrated edge, and that was the one that caused 11 of the potentially 12 fatal wounds. Harrowing. Torey is the first one to be interviewed by the police on the 24th of September. Basically, he says, look, yeah, we were with Cassie and Matt, but we left because we thought there was going to be a party, and it turned out there wasn't. I watched a film at the cinema, can't recall any of the details, even though I'm a massive film buff. And then Brian's interviewed on the 25th of September. He again says, oh, I watched the movie, and he at least remembers the name of it. That's right. Torey didn't even know the name of the film that he'd watched. But Brian does know its pulse. Again, cannot describe any of the details. And everyone knows that these two kids are film buffs. They then have a second interview. And at that point, they're like, right, we've got to think about an alibi. We've got to create some kind of excuse. All right. We'll say that we didn't go to the movies because we were stealing things from cars. So almost like, look, we're going to say the reason that we didn't tell you the truth was we are guilty of breaking into cars, and we didn't want to tell you because that's an illegal thing to do. To some degree, it's quite a clever ruse, isn't it? Because you're saying you are guilty of bad things, but not that thing. So you're using your crime as an excuse for not committing the actual crime being investigated. But then there is a third interview on the 27th of September, and Brian Draper says, okay, I was involved in the killing, but it wasn't me. It was all Torey. In fact, He said, I just thought we were gonna play a prank. But then Torey started stabbing her. And also Brian Draper tries to suggest that Torey threatened him and said, I'm gonna kill you if you tell the police. And as I mentioned earlier on, it was Brian Draper who told the police that they buried the clothing and weapons at Black Rock Canyon, took them there, and the objects were found. There was a pair of black boots, a pair of blue rubber gloves, a pair of fingerless gloves, a horrific multicoloured mask, a really large dagger-type knife with a sheath, a black-handled serrated folding knife, and DNA testing revealed that Stoddart's blood was on the blade. There was also a pair of partially burned black Puma brand gloves, and DNA testing revealed that Stoddart's blood had soaked into them. And of course, there was the videotape. The videotape that would later be repaired and used in evidence against them. Brian Draper was arrested on the 27th of September 2006. He was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and on the fourth interview, he also admitted that he'd stabbed her. He said that he was pressured by Torey to do that, but he did. He stabbed her in the leg and the chest. Torey Adamcik, when he was interviewed, stuck to his story. He said that Draper and he had been stealing from cars. He did not accept that he was involved. He even struggled when they were interrogating him to then describe what cars they'd broken into. So he really hadn't thought this through. But at that point, the police were like, Torey, we know what happened. We've got the evidence. And at that point, he just nodded. Imagine what that would have been like for Torey. That moment hearing that no matter what you were saying, they already knew that you were the guilty party. It would have been a very shocking moment, wouldn't it? Now, both of these boys at 16 years old were tried as adults. It's a big deal. Because at 16, you are not developed fully in your brain. You really aren't. You'll notice that's why we do refer to children and young people as psychopaths. We don't expect psychopaths to be fully formed until they're adults. So when they're younger, we use terms like conduct disorder. We use oppositional defiance disorder. We use lots of terms that might suggest that the young person has got troubles and is acting in a way that society would not accept, but actually there is an opportunity for that young person to develop and grow and change. So at 16, to be tried as adults means that we are not accepting that their brains aren't fully formed. In fact, we are holding them fully culpable for their actions. Both of them pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Each of them blamed the other. Of course they did. That's what kids do, isn't it? That's what kids do, right? You blame each other. Brian Draper basically said, look, it was completely Torey's deal. He was the one who made me stab Cassie. And of course, Torey said, I didn't have any involvement. I literally left the room whilst Brian killed her. But it was very obvious by the autopsy that two knives had been used, one with a serrated edge. So it clearly showed that they had both been involved. As I said, it's amazing that 11 out of the 12 fatal wounds were made by the one that was with the serrated edge, because it shows that that was the person who probably had the biggest intent in murder. Now, the prosecution, right from the get-go, were very clear that as far as they were concerned, Brian Draper was massively inspired by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. That was his motivation. However, I do think it's important to note at this point that there was no DNA found from Draper on the buried items, but there was DNA found beneath Cassie's fingernails. I hate that idea. I hate the fact that when she was being stabbed, she was probably grabbing on him or pushing him away, because that's what would have happened in that situation. They were also able to find a story that Brian Draper had written called Black River, and that very much detailed a plan to carry out this massive school shooting on a date just 2 weeks after killing Cassie. So desperately thinking about how to make himself visible. On the 17th of April 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. On the 31st of May 2007, Adamcik's trial starts. At this point, the prosecution state that Torey Adamcik was absolutely inspired by the horror franchise Scream. When they did searches, they found violent drawings, they found lists of items that he said were required for a mass murder, and they found him guilty on the 8th of June 2007 of the first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Unsurprisingly. I mean, it's not that hard when you videotaped yourself and made absolutely sure that everyone knows who your victim was, when you were going to do it, how you were going to do it, and after you did it. I mean, I don't even think there should have been a trial. It should just have been like, yeah, guilty, we've got it on tape. But this is what happens with justice. You go through the motions, right? But I cannot imagine for 1 minute the jury was sitting there going, this is a difficult one. This is hard. I mean, God, you know, you can't be sure, can you? I mean, they could just have made that tape and it could just surprisingly have coincidentally have happened that somebody else had done the murders. But yeah, no, I think it would have been very, very simple. Like, should we just go for a sandwich and all agree guilty? But you can see, can't you, the immaturity of these two boys. And it is immature because they had managed to bring themselves bound to rights by videoing themselves. And I say that because, again, we have to look at the emotional immaturity of these 16-year-old kids. Remember who you were at 15 and 16. Remember. They were both given life sentences without parole. They were also given, on top of that, 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder because they premeditated it. That's whole life tariff from 16. Both of the boys, before they were sentenced, apologised for the killing, and Brian Draper said, "All I ask is you to give me the punishment I deserve for my part in this crime. That is the only way I will be able to find some sort of closure, by getting what I deserve." Torey Adamcik said, "I feel terrible for Cassie's family and my family and friends, and especially for Cassie. What happened to her was monstrous." I do note that Brian is very willing to acknowledge the gravity of his actions. When I've heard him in interviews, he does not run from it. He stays with it. He holds himself bound to it. He knows what he did was hideous. Torey, on the other hand, well, he tries to retain an innocent position, and I don't think that's healthy. I really don't. But maybe that's because he's got such supportive parents who love him dearly and visit him all the time, and he doesn't want them to think of him in that way. The reason that Judge Peter McDermott gave them those sentences is he felt that those boys were so disturbed they'd kill again if they were ever released. Both of them are currently at maximum security Idaho State Correctional Institution. They even chose to be driven to prison in the same car. And when they were in that car, they both agreed that there was no animosity. Yes, they blamed each other in the trials, but they didn't blame each other. The person who was driving even said that they chatted in a really friendly manner, they joked with the driver. They even asked him if they'd let them go. They said they were just dumb kids. Please let us go. Again, that emotional immaturity. Just hoping that that guy would just pull over, let them get out. Not recognising the gravity of what they had done. They've both, on multiple occasions, tried to appeal the sentence. They both feel that the people that they are now as adults are not comparable to the children that they were when they carried out those killings. Now, this is important to note because there has been a change in the law. There was a decision in Miller versus Alabama in 2012, which looks at the sentences of life without parole for juveniles is considered now unconstitutional. They recognise that because of this immature brain, and it is immature, and let me tell you, a 15-year-old is less able to describe emotions than a 9-year-old when they look at pictures. Their brain is going through a grey matter period, which means that it is not dealing with the world and reality as it will at 25 or 30. So it's important that we note that. They believe that an immature brain is a mitigating factor that should be considered. And that means that there is a potential opportunity for thousands, and I mean thousands in the States, of juvenile offenders to be reformed, to be allowed out. Because, of course, if your brain is not fully developed and you are given an opportunity to reform, that should mean that there is a chance for reparation. In spite of all of this, we also have to remember the victims in this. Cassie's cousin suffered depression after it, had a breakdown, attempted suicide. The Contreras couldn't go back to that house they left that day, but they've been unable to sell that property for years. And one of the most terrifying things about this, there was no motive. There wasn't a grievance. They didn't hate Cassie. In fact, Brian liked her. He fancied her. He felt really sad that she didn't pick him. Maybe one of the motivations was that he wanted to stop somebody else having somebody that he wished he could have. It just seems that both of these decided that they wanted to go on a killing spree. And they're also both of sound mind. You know, they didn't have any pre-existing psychological disorders, although I will say that Brian made it clear in a conversation with his mother that he did ask for therapy. But she didn't remember him doing so. But he said that he did ask for therapy. It does seem that both of them wanted to become notorious and famous killers. And you have to think about Cassie, because if she hadn't been the kind, compassionate, loving person, if she hadn't brought them into her world because she was non-judgmental and because she liked misfits, she liked anybody because she was a good-hearted girl. It just turned out she was in the wrong place, wrong time, wrong connections, wrong friendships. To all intents and purposes, that girl should be alive. What upsets me about this killing is that they killed her in a way that was to provoke the most fear possible. That's what really gets me about it. The banging, the smashing, the lights on, the lights off. They wanted to provoke terror. She lived what we witness in horror films. That was how her end was met. And it has to go down in history of one of the most terrifying murders that would ever be experienced. Brian Draper has expressed a lot of remorse, I will tell you that. Even on his cell wall, he's got R.I.P. Cassie, I love you. Please forgive me. But Torey Adamcik says that he's a victim. He says he's paying for Brian Draper's actions. No, you're not. No, you're not. You were there. You planned it. You executed it. You executed Cassie. And you made a choice. If you had wanted to stop that situation, you could have stopped it instantly. You chose not to. His mother has actually written a book that says, my son's innocent. And I get that. I get that his mum wants to believe that he's innocent. I get that he wants to believe he's innocent. The level of disassociation that we are capable of, the level of self-deception that we are able to give ourselves is amazing. It's part of the human condition. Even though Torey is absolutely guilty, I do believe he fully thinks that it wasn't his fault. And sadly, as a mother, what would you rather believe? That your son is an innocent victim of a brutal slaying that he bore witness to just thinking he was having a prank? Or a cold-blooded murderer who planned and premeditated the murder of an innocent girl? It's not hard to do the maths there, is it? Both Brian and Torey's families have supported them in their attempts to appeal the sentences. And I can understand why. Because they were 16. And they're not the people that they were. I genuinely believe that. Do I think that those boys have changed? Yeah. Do I think that with potential therapy, discipline, opportunities for reparation and restoration, that they could become good citizens in this world? Yes. You may not agree with me. You may find it abhorrent that I'm suggesting that two young men who senselessly, brutally, willingly, even joyfully and gleefully murdered a beautiful young girl, that I could for even a second imagine that they would walk the streets again. And I understand the anger that you might feel at that. But what I am saying is, do I feel that they can be rehabilitated? And I think yes. Do I believe that will happen? Probably not. Do I believe that it's okay to disagree with my point of view? Absolutely. If I was Cassie's family, I would not want them walking the streets ever. But that doesn't mean that they haven't changed. And it doesn't mean that their brains, now fully developed, cannot understand the gravity of their actions. My sympathy and empathy, though, lies with Cassie and her family. Her mother has never even changed the bedroom. She's left it exactly as it was. A testament to the daughter that should have grown into a woman, a wonderful addition to our society, a kind and loving partner, no doubt a loving mother at some point in her life. All of it stolen. It's a horrific experience to lose any family member, but to lose somebody to traumatic murder at the hand of friends, how do you even begin to process that? It's a very emotive case, guys. I'd be so interested to know what you think. And like I said, just because I'm saying that I believe that young people can be rehabilitated and that the men that they are now are not the boys that they were then, it doesn't excuse the crime. I just feel that 30 years in prison is enough time when you were 16 to serve and then to go on with your life and to give back to society. You may not agree with me, and that's fine. If they had been 25, I wouldn't be having this conversation. It's just because of what we know about the mitigating factors where brain development is concerned, and also the psychology of those boys who almost seem to see this as not real. They almost believed that this was not actually playing out, which again suggests that they didn't quite associate the reality of their actions. They've got full life tariffs, so chances are they won't ever get out. But I do think it's a good thing that we're starting to explore how criminals and the criminal brain can, at times, go a different way given the right therapeutic interaction. Whilst Brian Draper had a lovely family, a middle-class, lovely family in a lovely area, being brought up in a lovely way, it's also worth noting he was adopted. And when you're adopted, it can cause some real issues around attachment and abandonment. Like, why were you left? Why were you abandoned? It can make you feel like you stand out for all the wrong reasons. I think we have to acknowledge that that probably is a foundation of some of his insecurity. His family was amazing, but nonetheless, knowing that you're adopted is quite painful at times because you wonder what it is about you that makes you different. And maybe that exacerbated and amplified some of the feelings of deep insecurity and desperateness to belong somewhere that he experienced as a young adolescent. For me, Torey Adamcik still isn't at a place where he really understands the culpability level. The fact that he denies involvement, the fact that his parents think he's innocent, it's completely understandable, but it's very unhelpful. And it's unhelpful for lots of reasons. Let's say they do start to look at the fact that their sentences can't be for life because they were juveniles and they hadn't got a developed brain. Unless you are willing to take full responsibility for the crime and your part within it, it's highly unlikely that any appeal will be won. Because if you can't tell me that you know what you did, if you can't accept your guilt, then you're dangerous. Because if you think that the actions that you've carried out are acceptable to some degree to the point where you can deny them, then how can you be safely on the streets? Whereas with Brian, he says every single day he accepts it. He knows what he did. He's completely guilty. He's completely culpable. And he's worked through that. Doesn't make either of them better than the other, by the way. I'm just saying, you cannot honestly be reformed unless you fully accept what you did. And even though his mother probably thinks she's been really helpful in writing that book where he's innocent, I don't think that that's what he needs to know. I think Torey needs some help to come to terms with the gravity of his actions. I hope you found the case interesting. I think we all feel exactly the same way about Cassie, right? We feel that a beautiful young woman with so much potential was robbed. And that's a loss for all of us to experience. That is a loss for our society to experience. And I hope that at some point in the future, that family is able to find a level of peace. I don't know whether they will. They certainly deserve it. And I think that the one thing I take forward with me is when I look at Cassie Stoddart, I see the most beautiful, compassionate, kind girl with a big heart, a heart that left the door open for anybody to enter. And that's the only thing that really worked against her, isn't it? The fact that she wasn't willing to exclude people who didn't fit in. How can something so beautiful become so brutal? Join me next time. Like I said, if you've liked the content, I let it out on a Wednesday and a Sunday, same time, same place. And if you want to support me on Patreon, please do. See you again, guys. Take care.